Hello again, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP, and so today in this video I would like to talk about specifically Jungian psychology or Jungian depth psychology and typology. And primarily what this is going to look at is the relationship between Jung's original work as a psychologist and how it influenced his thinking of personality and what that means for Jungian typology and MBTI and personality theory in general. So, at least I can say briefly that within the 21st century and in the 20th century that the thoughts in psychology have headed towards behaviorism. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with behaviorism or that it doesn't have a useful aspect in character analysis and helping somebody figure out what they can practically do to change, influence, and understand themselves and other people. But I want to stress that that was not the original concern of Jung's work. That Jung's work was depth psychology and it was not behaviorism. So there is an aspect to MBTI and personality theory or Jungian typology that is often left out and or possibly ignored or not known or washed over. I think the only analyst I have heard in recent times that mentions any of Jung's original concepts when it comes to the psyche, persona, and the ego and the collective unconscious is Michael Pierce, and I respect his work, and anybody who's interested in personality theory should look at his videos and would have the same sort of respect and admiration for what he does. With that said, the first thing to understand about Jung's original thoughts were that Jung had an evolutionary model for his thoughts on personality, and Jung ascribed to a Darwinian view of the world, and through this Darwinian view of the world, he came to begin to describe spirit or noumena or just that which consciousness emerges from in a very specific way, and he called this the collective unconscious. It roughly follows that consciousness, its appearance in this world, is something that is ubiquitous across organisms, that anything that lives, anything that interacts and moves through an environment has a mode of being and has a mode of realization and differentiation amongst the latent field of information that we exist in. I think it would be wise for me to say that you can conceive of the world or think of the world as a rich matrix of information, um, meaning that when you move through an environment, you do not see and you cannot conceive all that's going on within it. You have the force of gravity acting on you. Unless you take a physics class, you don't realize that that's a thing. Unless, of course, you try to jump or something of that nature and you realize that there's this force pulling you down. Well, there's also particles that penetrate and move through the earth and bombard you as you walk down the street. Your eyes, they catch on to photons, and it's their sensitivity to photon and light emission that gives us our ability to see. And that is not the only light that exists on the electromagnetic spectrum. That light, it exists in so many different forms, and it's radioactive, and it has its frequency determines what can be done with it, what can be seen with it, and what can be known with it. Radio waves, um, X-rays, and different types of excuse me, uh, excuse me, I lost. Sorry. Different types of waves, radio waves, and electromagnetic waves that are radioactive. So light and how we perceive it, it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what it is. It's just that there's so much going on in an environment and information and within the information that's latent in the environment that An individual, an organism, is going to be able to see and understand, and it's only going to be able to see and understand it based off of what it is. But this ability to be conscious and to be immersed within this network and field of knowledge and to pull an existence out of it, it derives from a collective unconscious, a long, slow process that began with the first single-celled organism and aggregated over time up the chain of complexity and thought until it stands within man. And what Jung believed was and postulated that from the simplest life and from the simplest inclining or shining of consciousness to the greatest and well, relatively greatest thought and creative insight to the man or to mankind is a ubiquitous and numinous phenomena that pervades all thought and all existence, all consciousness, that it all stems and arises from a sort of uh, world of possibilities and expressions, which he called the collective unconscious. And quite honestly, that's the best I can describe it, because it's not something that it is empirically based, but it's not empirically substantiated. So it's something that is derived from an evolutionary model or an Darwinian thought, but it is not something that I think that can be proved scientifically. Despite what Jung says in his work, I don't think that it, but it is an important thought in understanding what typology means. Primarily, that typology in Jung's work was concerned with existence. It was concerned locally with the need for meaning within Western man after the disappearance of religion and the shrinking down of the ideas and sometimes the total uprooting of Judeo-Christian ideas that once pervaded all of Western thought and which protected people from nihilism. Jung, in his work, was trying to answer the question of Friedrich Nietzsche, his proposition that God was dead, and that now that God is dead, there exists a serious need for meaning. And how would one overcome this? Must we not become gods ourselves to fill the hole? That's a paraphrase of Nietzsche, but that's what was said. And Jung said, I am going to answer this question. I am going to take up this challenge. And he spent his work doing this. And I believe, I don't think it was explicitly stated, at least not in anything that I've read, that Jung conceived of the personalities to help people self-actualize. It is to say that archetypes, Jung had this very strong theory of archetypes that pervaded all of his network of thinking. And what an archetype is difficult to say, but it seems to be an image that has a religious significance to it. It seems to be an instrument that meaning emerges from, and that modes of existence or ways in one can act out sort of ritualistic and innate and general patterns of being come from. And it's to say that, so for an example, to make it more concrete, Jung had the archetype of the mother and said that this archetype existed in all cultures, and or the archetype of the divine child, and it's something that's within all people, and it's something that can be observed across all cultures, all ways of life, all modes of existence, all modes of being that human beings go through. They will have archetypal patterns present within them. And I consider in my thinking, in my conception of typology, that people temperament, people's personality, if you're an INTP, if you're an ENFJ, if you're an ENTJ, you are a representation of an archetype. That personality, that moniker, the acronym that Isabel Briggs and Meyer came up with is a description of an archetypal pattern of existence that you emerge from. And I'm going to get away from that, and I will talk about that in another video. But it's just to make clear in how I see Jung's work influencing typology and what it really means. So Jung's primary concern was self-actualization, and he was dealing with the quandary of existence and the existential burden of existence, the need for meaning in Western man. Jung literally wanted to bring the what he considered the subconscious elements of man that had receded back into his consciousness when the world was rationalized and materialized, essentially when science showed that the world may be inanimate and lifeless. Jung saw that that was an epoch at which meaning had left all of the world. The cosmopoetic view of the world and the mythopoetic view of the world had died and had been supplanted by this rational and empirical view. But Jung didn't believe that that stuff existed in the world to begin with. He believed that it was something that was within the consciousness of the individual and within the subconscious. And when these things were brought forth into the culture, that it just receded back into the subconscious. But Jung wanted to bring those things back out of the subconscious and have the world be revivified with the mythopoetic and the cosmopoetic aspects and elements of a person's consciousness. And that was just damn dangerous. I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to desire, but that was Jung's original intent, and I pull that from Jordan B. Peterson's work, again, who I admire and influences my thinking. So next I would like to talk about a thinker that is not Jung, but may help us understand how to better aggregate and tie Jung's original ideas to what we think about typology and its real use and its reason for existence is the psychologist Jean Piaget. And particularly what I want to talk about is Piaget's idea of how does one build knowledge, how does one come to know things. And Piaget was what people consider a constructivist, in which he believed that the self is something that's built, and the self is something that the self and ideas, that knowledge is a process, and this process is an ongoing one and a mediation between meaning and the unknown. And that's the way that Jordan B. Peterson phrases it. At least that's the way I've come to understand it, and that roughly Piaget believed that we had schema, and we use these schemas as representations and tools to get through an environment. And we would go through this process of building up knowledge and turning it into a schema, which you could think of as just a constellation of behaviors and actions, sort of a procedural model for how to function in an environment. And we use these to get through the environment. And then we're confronted with something that we don't know, that's unknown, and it shatters the schema. And then we have to, when we're met with the anomaly and the new knowledge that can shatter or at least disturb this schema, we assimilate it and we rebuild the schema and we start that cycle over. Now, Piaget believed that people did this in particular because of his idea that people's knowledge came from the body up. It was sort of a floor up perspective that people, we know what we know, we do what we do, and we build the structures we build because of our bodies, because of being embodied things. To have a body that is that has opposable thumbs, to have a body that has such a powerful visual cortex, that to have a body that is our perception is consistent with what we see, and then what we see has to say and what we perceive. To have that body means something very specifically about what a human being is or what a human being can be. It's to say that I think when we talk about typology, we divorce it from its biological and existential roots. And I want to bring the biology and the existentialism back into the talk and language of typology because I think it's very useful and it's very helpful. And more than just understanding oneself, but seeing uh, one's personality as the ideal self. Okay, so Piaget, he believed that you construct knowledge and you construct a person and their understanding from the body up and from the bottom up, that it really starts from the toes and then moves up through the chain of neural networks all the way till you get a complicated structure within the mind. And that this is the individual, that the individual is a biological being. Jung would agree with Piaget in saying that the individual is a biological being, and he would agree by way of the collective unconscious. So where is the collective unconscious stored? I'm going to merge these two ideas and say that the collective unconscious, how people can know it, how people can see it, is they can merely see and look at their bodies. You are some semblance of a long aggregation or a long process. You as a human being are a very old thing, and you're not so localized or just simply cut off from the rest of creation, if you want to think of it that way. And this is a means in which it is a means in which we can begin to understand ourselves and understand existence and the burden of existence and how to potentially overcome that burden. And then I would say that Jung would propose too that people, you are a cultural entity as well. So you're not only a biological being, but you are a cultural being. And you, the you you're familiar with and the you know is your ego, or at least what would Jung would call the ego. And it's here that I just implant my thoughts to sort of bring the to connect the trains of reasoning that your personality, it is the archetype that determines you, but then you, your conscious you, is something that emerges from that archetype. It is a resultant of the INTP, it is a resultant of the ENTJ, it is a resultant of the ENFP or the INFP, but you are not the INFP, you're not the ENFJ, you're not the INTP, you're you. You're a ego and you're an emergent structure that comes from the self or the ideal self, and that highest self or that ideal self that Jung championed would be your temperament, it would be your personality. And that, for me, constitutes the cultural aspects of what you are, but it doesn't stop there because obviously we all live in a culture because personality and psychology is just a ubiquitous phenomena. It happens independent of space and time. People are born and they have personalities, and they're existent in differing societies with differing rules and differing mandates. But that the societal rules and mandates, they're a bit complicated, and it's a bit complicated in saying that they're not perfect. And you're going to come into the world and realize that they're not perfect, and you're going to want to do something about that. Necessarily what you should do about that is embedded in the ideal self. But I don't want to discuss that much more, and I don't want to labor this thought anymore. It is just to say that typology, what it is a tool for self-actualization, and that if we go back to Jung's thoughts and use the thoughts of other psychologists that came after Jung in understanding the self and what it means to exist, I think that typology can have a powerful effect on how it is we get through the world, and one that's contained more than just in understanding ourselves or understanding others, but helping ourselves actualize and get to a higher place and to really find meaning. Thank you.